Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to Tana Tibble Healing Works. Again, my name is High Priestess Tana, and I would like to discuss a subject that is very, very important that we usually don't discuss a lot just openly about Detroit, right? A lot of people don't really openly talk about Detroit having a history of slavery. So, as you know, Detroit was founded in 1701. If you don't know already, you know now, and it was part of New France. Originally, its name was not Detroit. Well, at least the name Detroit was in there, but it wasn't just named Detroit at the time. It was called Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit. So, yeah, and it was based on fur trading and settlements with European settlers who will also trade with the indigenous peoples. And then eventually, once the fur trade had took off, they end up enslaving indigenous people and African people. African slaves was brought to Detroit as well. So you had a mixture of both indentured servants and chattel slavery as well. So and it was used to help the economy. Unfortunately, just like in the South, and in the South, we know about chattel slavery and the impact that it had on American society and American history, as well as the Black community or foundational Black Americans or African Americans or Black Americans, whatever you want to be labeled, however you want to be labeled as well, but also in Detroit. And not only slavery not only impacted African people, it impacted indigenous people too. So actually, from my understanding, from what I was reviewing, that there were more indigenous slaves than there were African slaves in Detroit. And that's not surprising because the indigenous people were already established in Detroit anyway, so that made a lot of sense. But it's very surprising because I didn't know that slavery, even though it wasn't um, as significant in amount of slaves as it was down south, it still existed and it still needs to be acknowledged. So, um, I wanted to just give a brief overview of the city of Detroit. Also, I would like to say the name Detroit is really pronounced as Detroit. So if you hear me going back and forth, I'm just trying to keep up with the historical context of how they will pronounce it back then. But really, Detroit is a French word that means straight, not straight as in Straight, but Strait. Okay, so straight like the Bering Strait, because of Detroit being surrounded by so many different lakes, like the Great Lakes and stuff. I'm assuming that's why, because Detroit is surrounded by water, okay? And let's see, it's been a hot spot for years. And actually, Detroit or Detroit, or at the time it was known as like I said, Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit. And it was founded by a man by the name of Antoine Lomé du Lamont Cadillac. But most people will pronounce his last name Cadillac. And it's interesting because a lot of people from Detroit like Cadillac cars and stuff. So yeah, he was part of that Cadillac family or whatever. This man, Antoine Lomé du Lamont Cadillac, okay? So he was the founder of Detroit at the time. And basically, it was a French establishment at first, but eventually the British took over in 1760 from seven. Okay, so New France controlled Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit, or also known as the city of Detroit, present day Detroit, from 1701 to 1760. And Great Britain ended up controlling the city from 1760 to 1796. So I wanted to talk about that. And as I mentioned, the settlement was based on fur trade, but as well as farming and missionary work, also developed in the area that we know as Detroit. And also, the fort was located in what is known as being downtown Detroit. Okay. So, if you want to know why downtown Detroit has a lot of like spiritual energy down there you go. You just found out today. And basically its location will be present day northeast of the intersection of Washington Boulevard and West Jefferson Avenue. Okay. So I just wanted to give that brief overview. Now, it's funny because I was talking about Detroit. The word Detroit literally means straight. Strait, because of how its location around the Great Lakes and rivers and such. So the river flowing between Lake St. Clair and Lake Erie was called Lake des Trois du Lac Erie by the French, the Strait of Lake Erie. And in 1698, Antoine Lomé de la Mole Cadillac, who had previously commanded Fort de Bois or Boyd, and how do you pronounce that? Was it Michili Oh goodness, proposed the settlement of a colony at Detroit. Interesting. French families will be recruited as settlers, and indigenous tribes living near Michili Mackinac will be encouraged to migrate to the area. Interesting. All right, let's jump down because this is a lot going on here. So the settlement will not only prevent English expansion into the was it Pays d'en Haut, Pays d'en Haut, upper country, but also deter Iroquois aggression. Jerome Philpot de Pontchartrain, I think that's how you pronounce his name. The French the French Secretary of State of the Navy approved the plan despite the misgivings of New France's governor and attendant. In June 1701, Cadillac set out from, was it La Chine, near Montreal, with 100 settlers and soldiers. Right. The expedition followed a northerly route up to Ottawa River and across to Georgia Bay and Lake Huron. The expedition reached Grosse Ile, or is that Grosse Ile? I always mess that name up, y'all. On the Detroit River on July 23rd. The following day, the expedition returned upstream several miles to a bluff on the north shore of the river at its narrowest point. Cadillac commenced the construction of a fort at this location, which he named Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit. The first building completed was a chapel dedicated to Saint Anne, the patron of New France or New France. I may say France, go back and forth. It just sounds better, like a little bit more bougie, right? In September, the first two European women arrived at the fort. Cadillac's wife, Marie Therese Guyon, and Marie Anne Picote de Belestre, the wife of Cadillac's lieutenant, Alphonse de Tonti. Wow, this is interesting. So let's go ahead. Let's expedite this, right? So, let's check this out. I'm going to talk about Bilal in a different video because that has a, a a spiritual energy around that as well that I'm going to talk about. But I want to talk about some things that is going to segue into discussing about slavery, right? So more in depth in Detroit. So let's go down to that part. So um where was I? There's something that I was looking for. Wait a minute. Okay, there we go. So basically, slavery existed in Michigan, period, right? So, for what I was understanding, that, okay, 10% of Detroit's, of early Detroit's population was made up of indentured servants, okay? And they worked for 5 to 7 years, paying off the cost of their transportation to the New World or debts. And they were free. And although they were free, their contracts could be bought and sold. Wow. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. And also, it has been historically documented that 523 Native American and 127 Black enslaved people, which was a total of 650 people from the 18th century and 19th century Detroit, existed. Okay. And the average lifespan for an enslaved Native American was 17.2 years. And the average lifespan for a Black slave was 25.2 years. That was interesting. So that means that they had very difficult lives, obviously, as a slave, and they probably weren't living in the best conditions, even though a lot of their owners were very wealthy, for what it sounded like, especially if they were a part of a fur trade or some type of rich, wealthy type of background of French descent or something of that nature, or from England eventually when it or Great Britain when the British took over. Let's see. Yeah, I figured this. A lot of the Native Americans who were enslaved, let's see. Ooh, hold up. They're talking about, oh, they're saying that the Native Americans had also enslaved people. And they said that this was happening way before contact with Europeans. Yeah, because even in Africa, Africans were trading other Africans or enslaving other Africans, like warring tribes and stuff. And that's basically what I'm reading. Like, it's something like that. Every culture has that. That's fucked up. But, slavery is fucked up in general. But, Yes. Oh, wow. It's saying that enslaved people were traded among other tribes. They were subject to torture. Many enslaved people had their ears cut off or their eyes gouged out. Damn. That's why I paused for a minute. I was like, whoa, okay. That's bad. They did not consider slaves their property, although slaves were used as gifts during negotiations and trade. All right, now we're going to jump to New France, right? So basically, um, it said from in New France or New France from 1534 to 1763. Um, they're talking about like basically when the French came to. Oh, okay, let's go back. New France, it was existed from 1534 to 1763. I did not know it existed from 1534. Damn. To 1763. But what they're describing is that when the French came to present day Michigan, they had slaves and encouraged Native people to trade enslaved people. So most of the slaves in present day Michigan resided in Detroit or at the trading post at the Straits of Mackinac, later on Mackinac Island. Wow. Slavery was practiced in Detroit since its founding in 1701. That's wow. That's why I'm like, whoa. Um, I didn't know that New France had existed that long. And it says that the settlement included Fort Pontchartrain, a government trade store on the Detroit River, and ribbon farms. Wow. This is crazy. Hmm. So check this out. They said both the French citizens and their slaves were Roman Catholics in New France. Louis XV's ordinance of 1724, Code Noir, required that slaves were to be educated and baptized. They had designated godparents who were free. The enslaved people's major life events from birth through death occur within the auspices or auspices of the church. Auspicious, yeah. The role of the church meant that slaveholders did not have absolute dominion over their bond servants. One quarter of Detroit's residents owned slaves in 1750. Damn. Fur traders used enslaved Native Americans and African Americans to operate boats, handle furs, grow food, cook, and clean. About 25% of Detroit's populations were enslaved workers, but they produced one half of the town's primary products beef, oats, and wheat. Wow. Fur traders who lived in the wilderness took Native American enslaved women as partners and companions, some of whom became interpreters or paid subordinate traders. Some farmers owned and worked alongside their slaves or hired men. John Askin, an 18th century fur trader, owned 8 enslaved people, one of them an Ottawa woman named Monet, or I think it's Monet, gave birth to 3 of Askin's children. Wow. So, yeah, this is interesting. And it says, under the British rule or British American colonies, 1763 1787, enslaved African Americans were also brought to Detroit by British settlers. Some of them came from slave markets in New York. Wow. Native Americans raided European settlements to preserve Native American territorial lands, and they captured African Americans, bond servants. Native tribes often traveled with military soldiers, and some officers owned slaves. There were 73 slaves in Detroit in 1773, and 9 years later, the number grew to 170. Wow. Free and enslaved blacks were recruited to fight during the American Revolutionary War, and enslaved men were freed in return. Blacks received veterans benefits. Two black loyalists of Butler's Rangers gained their freedom and received land grants near Detroit. All right, so also they talked about the Northwest Territory from 1787 to 1803. And they said the current state of Michigan was part of the Northwest Territory in 1787 when the Northwest Ordinance made slavery illegal with the clause neither slavery or nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the territory. So even though people were enslaved, they were still enslaved living in Michigan until 1837. This was put in place, and it says French and British slave owners in the Northwest Territory continued to own slaves due to loopholes in American law. That's messed up. The ordinance was interpreted to mean that no more new slaves could be brought into the area, but apparently they kept doing it. From what it sounds like, that's crazy. So, with J Treaty between Great Britain and the United States, it made it illegal to buy and sell slaves. The treaty didn't change the status, though, of 300 existing slaves who lived in Detroit in 1795. And then you got Catholic priests owned slaves, and a slave helped build the Basilica of Saint Anne de Troyes in 1800. Wow, enslaved people helped build the city of Detroit. You heard that? I'm going to say it again. Enslaved people helped build the city of Detroit. Yes, they did. Mm, 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 mm. Wow. It says enslaved people generally slept on their slave holders' kitchen floors. And although there were some cases where they lived in a separate building, particularly if it was a family, subject to physical violence, some were maimed. Basically like kind of like beat to death or something, or severely beaten. Women were subject to sexual violence. I knew it. Some enslaved people were hired out to others, which allowed them freedom to walk in the streets of the city. Some bond servants married into families of slaveholders. What is a bond servant? Serfdom was the status of many peasants under feudalism, specifically relating to manualism and similar systems. It was a condition of debt bondage and indentured servitude with similarities to differences from slavery. Wow. Unlike slaves, serfs could not be bought, sold, or traded individually, though they could, depending on the area, be sold together with land. Wow. Wow. Okay, that was crazy. So we're gonna jump down here and wrap this up really quickly. It was saying that enslaved people found safety with Michigan territorial residents in Canada or working along the Great Lakes. John Askins bondswoman Madeline and others fled him to work along the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes hold a lot of spiritual energy as well, because I kept picking up something about that, like slavery and lost souls, or like souls that's just lingering around. Oh my goodness. So yeah, this is deep, y'all. I may have to do a part two to this because there are a lot of different things that are being covered in this. It says some of the slaves. Wait a minute. Let's go back. Anti slavery sentiment grew over time so that by the 19th century, once an individual crossed the international border to or from Canada, people were free and were not returned to slavery. Slave catchers who searched for fugitives were harassed in Detroit. In 1806, an overseer was legally tarred and feathered. Damn, I heard of that before too. And when I was in school, I read about that. Following Detroit's devastating fire in 1805, the plan to rebuild included giving land grants to free and some enslaved black people. Some filed freedom suits or writs of habeas corpus, but few won their freedom through the courts, even when it was clear that people remained enslaved illegally. In one case, in the matter of Elizabeth Dennison, and it says was tried in 1807. Wow. I'm going to make a part two because they're talking about the Underground Railroad and stuff. I want to talk about that, but that was a mouthful. That was a lot. So I am going to continue. I'm going to do a part two because uh, after slavery was outlawed, Detroit became a critical hub of the Underground Railroad. And due to its proximity to Canada, slavery was abolished in 1834 and made it a key crossing point for escaping enslaved people. So some notable figures was George de Baptiste and Sojourner Truth, who spent time in Michigan and they helped support and organize escapes. So even though Detroit wasn't on a big scale of slavery, amounts of slaves on southern plantations, they basically legally supported it and they basically used slaves for their own economic significance. So y'all, this been real, and this, I just want to say that I learned a lot. I did initial research, but as I'm going back to this, I was like, this is a lot to cram in one video. And I want to give my respect to those people who lost their lives and who may be even related to these formerly enslaved individuals. Hell, I could be related to them. I don't know. I still have to tap into my family history a little deeper. But yeah, this oh my goodness. They said by the early 1830s, slavery had almost disappeared in Detroit, but I'm going to come back with a part two, y'all, because this was a lot. This was a lot. All right. Stay blessed, y'all. Thank you for watching this video, part one. I'll be back with part two a little later on. All right. Peace. Thank you. Love y'all much.